All right, so this is our third and final video looking at the individual firm's cost curves. The basic topic of this brief video is looking at how cost curves shift. It's nothing very complicated, really. It's a little complicated conceptually, but we're not going to be doing a lot of drawing here. But again, just want to expose you here. And also, this is a review. So if we think back to our earlier videos on supply and demand, we had a scenario with the cookbooks where the cookbook industry was able to adopt a technology that allowed it to produce cookbooks at a lower cost. So in particular, it allowed firms to produce more of the good using the same amount of inputs and keeping the prices of those inputs the same. So if we're talking about same amount of goods, producing more goods at using the same amount of inputs, we could kind of turn this around and say it's the same thing as being able to produce the same amount of goods at a lower cost. They're consistent comments. Okay? So same amount of goods at a lower cost. So the question is, how would that kind of technology change look on a firm's cost curves? Okay? So we have our standard individual firm's cost curves. We have the marginal cost curve. That's telling us, for given levels of output, how much does it cost to produce one more unit of output? Our average total cost curve, again, we're reading it at a particular level of output. What's the unit cost of production? Okay? So, again, we want to, maybe what we'll do is we'll say marginal cost. When you learn this in introductory micro, it was the change in total cost over the change in output. And for average total cost, it's simply the total cost divided by the quantity. Okay? So we have these cost curves. Because they're coming out of the same total cost curve, you want to keep in mind, or always remember, that these cost curves will always move together. You will not have a situation where only the marginal cost curve changes and the average total cost doesn't. Because they're coming out, if the total cost curve is changing, then the marginal cost curve changes, and the average total cost curve changes. Okay? So, if the cost of production or if the total cost curve is changing, both these curves will move together. Okay? So, with the adoption of the technology, our costs are coming down. So at any given level of output, so at any of these vertical slices, our marginal cost and average total cost curves should shift down. So the question is, how would this change our profit maximizing level of output? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So how would it change our maximum profit if the price remained the same? So we're talking about a situation, price remains the same, technology shifts. So let's look at what the pictures would look like. Okay, so costs are coming down. So at any given level of price, we would expect our unit costs to come down. Okay? So I'll just draw the average total cost first. And so marginal cost curve, average total cost curve. So what's happening is at any given level of output, so we'll just choose one here, our average total costs of production have fallen, which makes sense. If you're more efficient, you don't need as much money to produce that same level of output. Same thing with our marginal costs. If we have a more efficient technology, if we're able to, at some given level of output, it will cost us less to produce that next unit of output, because we don't really need as much of the inputs to generate that next level of output, so therefore it's going to cost us less. Okay? So, we have the story of increase in efficiency, the cost curves shift down together. If you look at any of those other shifters, we could come up with, even with the same technology shifter, we could come up with a story, or I would ask you to come up with a story to explain how cost curves could shift up. Out of that list of technology out of that list of supply shifters that we talked about in the supply and demand videos, which categories would be relevant? What story would you tell that would generate a change such that these cost curves shift up? Okay? So another thing I want you to think about, technically speaking, go back to the red here, if we use our marginal revenue equals marginal cost rule, before the good technology change, we had our Q star based on price intersecting with the marginal cost. We have the beneficial technology change and increased efficiency. No change in the market price. So what happens? Well, we actually have an increase in the profit maximizing level of output. Okay? And we would expect an increase in the profit. But you could go through the example of showing that. But the key thing is to keep in mind that every time there's a change in a situation, technology change, a price change, you're going to have to go through the whole profit maximizing exercise again. Okay? A couple of last items I just want to point out just before we wrap up this, these videos on cost curves. Okay? First of all, when we went through in the previous video talking about how to calculate the total cost of production, we just said, well, you multiply for a given level of output, multiply that output times the average total cost. The underlying math of the marginal cost curve, especially if you've had calculus, you would recognize this. Theoretically speaking, we could say at any given level of output, if we know what the marginal cost curve, marginal cost is, and we know what the curve looks like, we could say that the area under the cost curve, bounded by the quantity and the axes, would represent the total cost. I only throw that out for those of you who have had calculus or are interested in going further in economics, but it's just the second way to kind of determine what the total cost of production would be. Secondly, I just want to point out that we talked about a technology change, but there's also this idea of increasing the size of the firm. So we started out with a particular set of cost curves. It's getting a little messy here, but again, it's just the general idea we're talking about. So this firm represents, is a certain size. If we double the size of the firm, and we'll assume that the technology is scale neutral, that if you double the size, there's no particular benefits or losses to being bigger or smaller, you're just doubling the size of the firm. Well, all you're doing is moving these two cost curves to the right. Okay? So it's just a straight shift to the right. I point that out because a little later in the quarter, we're going to be talking about, you're going to do the reading by Willard Cochran, and he's going to talk about some of the implications of increasing scale and the impact on production and prices. Okay? And that's it for the cost curve.